The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he rode into the small town of Cedar Creek. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, was tired from the long journey across the desert. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, searching for work and a place to call home, even if just for a while. The town looked quiet, almost too quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Most frontier towns would be bustling with activity by now, but Cedar Creek felt different. Jake noticed how people quickly looked away when he rode past, and shop owners seemed to close their doors a little faster than normal. Jake was a tall man with sun-weathered skin and kind blue eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone only 28 years old. His clothes were worn but clean, and his hat bore the marks of countless miles under the open sky. He had been a cowboy most of his adult life, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections with people. As he guided Belle toward the saloon, Jake noticed a small group of people gathered near the general store. Their voices were hushed, but their faces showed worry and fear. He decided to investigate, hoping to understand what was troubling this seemingly peaceful town. "Excuse me," Jake said, tipping his hat to an elderly woman in a faded blue dress. "I'm new in town. Is everything all right here?" The woman looked at him suspiciously at first, then seemed to soften when she saw the genuine concern in his eyes. "You best be careful, stranger," she whispered. "There's been trouble with Apache raids lately. They took some folks just last week." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had heard stories about conflicts between settlers and Apache tribes, but he had always hoped to avoid such situations. "Anyone hurt?" he asked quietly. A middle-aged man with a sheriff's badge stepped forward. "Name's Tom Bradley. I'm the sheriff here. 3 families lost members in the raids. We think they were taken captive, but we don't have enough men to go looking for them." Jake studied the sheriff's face and saw the weight of responsibility crushing the man's spirit. Sheriff Bradley looked like he hadn't slept in days, and his clothes were wrinkled as if he'd been wearing them for too long. "I might be able to help," Jake offered, though he wasn't sure what he could actually do. "I know the desert pretty well, and I'm good with a rifle." The sheriff shook his head sadly. "I appreciate the offer, son, but this isn't your fight. Besides, tracking Apache warriors through their own territory is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands." Jake nodded, understanding the sheriff's point, but something inside him wouldn't let the matter rest. He had always felt drawn to help others, even when it meant putting himself at risk. It was both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. After getting a room at the small hotel and stabling Belle, Jake spent the evening in the saloon, listening to conversations and trying to learn more about the situation. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the missing families, and Jake could feel their fear hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. That night, lying on the thin mattress in his hotel room, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the families who had been taken and the pain their loved ones must be feeling. He had never had a family of his own, but he could imagine the desperate worry that would consume a person when someone they loved disappeared. The next morning, Jake decided to ride out and scout the area where the raids had occurred. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but sitting in town doing nothing felt wrong to him. He packed enough supplies for a few days and headed toward the foothills where the attacks had taken place. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way. Red rocks jutted up from the desert floor like ancient monuments, and the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and orange. Jake had always found peace in wide open spaces, but today the vastness felt threatening rather than comforting. After riding for about 2 hours, Jake found the remains of one of the attacked homesteads. The small cabin had been burned, and personal belongings were scattered across the ground. Jake dismounted and walked through the ruins, feeling like he was intruding on someone's private tragedy. Near what had once been the front door, Jake found a child's doll with singed hair and a torn dress. The sight hit him harder than he expected, and he had to take a moment to compose himself. Somewhere out there, a little girl was missing her doll, and probably missing her family even more. As Jake continued examining the scene, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were tracks leading away from the homestead, but they weren't just Apache pony tracks. Mixed in with them were the footprints of women and children, some small enough to belong to young kids. Jake followed the tracks for about a mile before they disappeared into rocky terrain where the ground was too hard to hold impressions. He was about to turn back when he heard something that made him freeze, the sound of voices carried on the wind. Carefully, Jake led Belle behind a large boulder and crept forward on foot. Peering around the edge of the rock, he saw something that surprised him. About 100 yards away, near a small spring, there was an Apache camp. But this wasn't a war party, it was families, including women and children. Among the Apache families, Jake could see 3 people who clearly didn't belong. 2 women in torn settler dresses and a young boy, maybe 10 years old, sat near one of the Apache family groups. They didn't appear to be tied up or guarded closely, which confused Jake. As he watched, one of the Apache women approached the settler women and offered them food. The interaction didn't look hostile at all. In fact, it seemed almost caring. Jake rubbed his eyes, wondering if the desert sun was playing tricks on him. One of the Apache children, a girl who looked to be about 8 years old, was playing with the settler boy. They were laughing together as they splashed water from the spring on each other. Jake had expected to find captives in terrible conditions, but what he was seeing didn't match his expectations at all. Jake knew he needed to get closer to understand what was really happening, but he also knew that approaching an Apache camp uninvited could be very dangerous. He decided to watch and wait, hoping to learn more about the situation before making any moves. Hours passed, and Jake continued to observe the camp. He noticed that the Apache family seemed to be treating the settler captives more like guests than prisoners. The women were given blankets and food, and no one seemed to be preventing them from moving around the camp freely. As the sun began to set, Jake saw something that made his heart race. A group of Apache warriors rode into the camp, and their leader appeared to be angry about something. The man gestured forcefully while talking to the other Apache people, and Jake could see tension building in the group. The peaceful atmosphere of the camp changed quickly. The Apache women moved the settler captives closer to the center of the camp, and the children stopped playing. Whatever the war leader was saying, it was causing concern among everyone in the camp. Jake wished he could understand Apache language, but he could tell from body language and tone that some kind of disagreement was taking place. The older Apache man who seemed to be the family leader kept shaking his head and pointing toward the settler captives, while the war leader grew more agitated. Suddenly, the war leader pulled out his knife and pointed it toward the settler woman. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, though he knew that starting a gunfight would probably get everyone killed, including the people he was hoping to help. The family leader stepped between the war leader and the captives, and, for a moment Jake thought violence was about to break out within the Apache group itself. The tension in the air was so thick that even from his hiding spot, Jake could feel his heart pounding. Then, something unexpected happened. 2 Apache girls, who looked to be teenagers, stepped forward and stood beside the family leader. They spoke to the war leader in firm voices, and Jake could see that they were not backing down despite his obvious anger. The war leader seemed surprised by the girls' boldness. He lowered his knife and listened to what they were saying. The longer they talked, the more his expression seemed to change from anger to confusion, and, then, to something that looked almost like respect. Finally, the war leader nodded and walked away from the captives. The Apache girls had somehow managed to defuse a situation that could have turned deadly. Jake was amazed by their courage and wondered what they could have said that was powerful enough to change the war leader's mind. As darkness settled over the desert, Jake knew he needed to make a decision. He could try to sneak away and report what he had seen to the sheriff, but that would likely result in a violent confrontation that could end badly for everyone. Or he could try to make contact with the Apache camp and see if there was a way to resolve the situation peacefully. The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that something unusual was happening here. The Apache family seemed to be protecting the settler captives rather than holding them prisoner. And those two brave Apache girls had just prevented what could have been a tragedy. Jake decided to take a risk. Instead of sneaking away or trying to rescue the captives by force, he would approach the camp openly and try to communicate with the Apache families. It was dangerous, but it felt like the right thing to do. As he prepared to reveal himself, Jake thought about how this moment would change everything. He was no longer just a drifting cowboy looking for work. He was about to become part of a story that was much bigger and more complicated than he had ever imagined. The desert wind picked up, rustling the sagebrush around him as Jake took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the boulder. Whatever happened next would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of all the people in that camp, Apache and settler alike. Jake raised his hands above his head to show he wasn't carrying any weapons and began walking slowly toward the Apache camp. His heart hammered against his ribs with each step, but he kept moving forward. There was no turning back now. When he was about 50 feet from the camp, several Apache warriors noticed him and immediately grabbed their weapons. Jake stopped walking and called out in the calmest voice he could manage, "I come in peace. I want to talk." The camp erupted in activity as everyone turned to look at the unexpected visitor. Jake could see the settler captives watching him with expressions of hope and fear mixed together on their faces. The Apache warriors surrounded him quickly, but they didn't attack. The family leader approached Jake cautiously, studying his face and posture. The old man's eyes were sharp and intelligent, and Jake could see him trying to determine whether this stranger represented a threat or an opportunity. "Why do you come here, white man?" the Apache leader asked in heavily accented but clear English. "This is not your place." Jake chose his words carefully. "I heard about missing families from the town. I came looking for them, but I can see this is not what I expected to find." The Apache leader nodded slowly. "You expected to find us torturing prisoners? Preparing for war?" "Honestly, yes," Jake admitted. "But that's not what I see here." For a long moment, the two men looked at each other in silence. Jake could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see what would happen next. The future of everyone in this camp might depend on the next few words that were spoken. Finally, the Apache leader smiled slightly. "You are either very brave or very foolish, cowboy. Come. Sit by our fire. There are things you need to understand before you make any decisions about what you have seen here." Jake felt relief wash over him as he was invited into the camp rather than being driven away or worse. As he walked toward the fire, he caught sight of the two Apache girls who had stood up to the war leader earlier. They were watching him with curious expressions, and Jake had the feeling that they would play an important role in whatever was about to unfold. The adventure was just beginning, and Jake Morrison was about to learn that sometimes the truth is very different from what people expect it to be. Jake sat cross-legged around the fire with the Apache family leader, whose name he learned was Standing Bear. The warmth from the flames felt good against his skin as the desert night grew cold. The smell of rabbit stew filled the air, and Jake's stomach growled quietly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since morning. "You want to know why the white families are here," Standing Bear said, stirring the fire with a long stick. It wasn't a question but a statement, and Jake nodded in response. "The story begins many seasons ago," Standing Bear continued, his weathered face thoughtful in the flickering firelight. "My people have lived in these lands for generations beyond counting. We know every rock, every stream, every hiding place in these mountains." Jake listened carefully, sensing that understanding this story was important for everything that would follow. When the white settlers first came, there was mistrust on both sides, Standing Bear explained. My people had heard stories of what happened to tribes in other places when white men arrived. Many of our warriors wanted to fight immediately, to drive out the newcomers before they could establish themselves. One of the Apache women, who Jake guessed was Standing Bear's wife, brought them both bowls of stew. She smiled kindly at Jake, which surprised him. He had expected hostility, not hospitality. "But, I am old," Standing Bear continued after thanking his wife. "I have seen enough war to know that fighting should be the last choice, not the first. So I tried to make peace with the settlers, to find a way for both peoples to live in these lands without destroying each other." Jake took a small sip of the stew and found it delicious. "What happened?" he asked. Standing Bear's expression grew sad. "Some white men came who did not want peace. They wanted only to take land, to push us away or kill us all. They attacked our hunting parties, killed our young men, and stole our horses." The fire crackled as Standing Bear paused, lost in painful memories. Jake could see the hurt in the old man's eyes and felt his own anger rising at the injustice of it. "My people began to demand revenge," Standing Bear said. "The young warriors said I was weak, that I was too old to lead. They wanted to raid the white settlements and take scalps." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. He was beginning to understand that he had walked into the middle of something much more complicated than a simple conflict between settlers and Apache. "But, then, something happened that changed everything," Standing Bear said, and, for the first time that evening, he smiled. "The daughters of my brother, Swift Eagle, showed me a different way." Standing Bear gestured toward the two teenage Apache girls who had confronted the war leader earlier. They were sitting nearby, helping to tend some of the younger children. In the firelight, Jake could see that both girls had intricate tattoos or paint markings on their faces and arms. "Ayana and Nailnish," Standing Bear said, indicating each girl in turn. "They speak both Apache and English well, and they are wise beyond their years." The girl named Ayana looked up when she heard her name. She had long black hair braided with feathers and beads, and her dark eyes seemed to see everything. Nailnish was slightly younger, with similar markings but arranged in different patterns across her face and hands. "3 weeks ago, my brother's daughters came to me with an idea," Standing Bear continued. "They had been watching the white families who live closest to our territory. They saw children playing, mothers caring for babies, fathers working to build homes for their families." Jake began to understand where the story was heading, and it wasn't what he had expected at all. "Ayana and Nailnish told me that the white families were not our enemies," Standing Bear said. "They were just people trying to live their lives, like we are trying to live ours. The real enemies were the bad white men who wanted to start a war between us." Standing Bear poked at the fire again, sending sparks dancing up into the dark sky. "The girls said we should protect the peaceful white families instead of fighting them. They said if we could save white lives, maybe the good white people would help us find peace with their leaders." Jake felt his respect for the two Apache girls growing with every word Standing Bear spoke. They had found a way to see beyond the cycle of violence and revenge that was threatening to destroy both communities. "So when the bad white men attacked the homesteads," Standing Bear continued, "we arrived just after they left. We found the surviving family members hiding and afraid. Instead of leaving them to die in the desert, we brought them here to keep them safe." "The bad white men?" Jake asked, confused. "You mean it wasn't Apache warriors who attacked the homesteads?" Standing Bear shook his head firmly. "White men dressed like Apache warriors. They wore paint and feathers, carried Apache weapons. But my daughters saw their horses' hoofprints, and Apache ponies do not wear iron shoes like white men's horses." Jake felt like he had been hit by a lightning bolt. "Someone was pretending to be Apache to make it look like your people attacked the settlers?" "Yes," Standing Bear said grimly. "Someone wants war between Apache and white settlers. But we do not know who or why." Jake's mind raced as he tried to process this information. If Standing Bear was telling the truth, then someone was deliberately trying to start a war between the Apache and the settlers. The raids that had terrified Cedar Creek weren't Apache attacks at all, but false flag operations designed to create conflict. "The families you rescued," Jake said slowly, "do they know the truth about what happened?" Standing Bear nodded toward the settler captives, who were now sleeping peacefully near one of the Apache family groups. At first they were very afraid. They thought we would kill them or worse. But Ayanna and Nailnish spoke to them in English, explained what really happened. Jake looked at the two Apache girls with new admiration. Not only had they come up with a plan to save lives and prevent war, but they had also taken on the dangerous job of convincing terrified settlers that their supposed enemies were actually their protectors. The white woman, Mary Henderson, saw the iron horseshoe prints too, Standing Bear added. She knows now that Apache did not attack her home. But she is afraid to go back to town because she does not know who she can trust. Jake understood Mary's fear. If someone in or near Cedar Creek was behind the fake Apache raids, then returning to town might put her and her family in even greater danger. "What about the war leader who was here earlier?" Jake asked. He seemed angry about the situation. Standing Bear's expression grew troubled. "Red Hawk leads the young warriors. He believes I am making a mistake by protecting white families. He says it makes us look weak, that other Apache bands will think we are afraid to fight. But your nieces changed his mind tonight?" "For now," Standing Bear said. "Ayanna and Nailnish have special gifts. Their face markings are not just decoration. They mark them as visionaries, as young women who can see things others cannot." Jake looked more closely at the intricate patterns painted or tattooed on the girls' faces and arms. In the firelight, the markings seemed to move and shift, creating an almost hypnotic effect. "Among our people, when someone receives the vision markings, their words carry great weight," Standing Bear explained. "Even Red Hawk must listen to what they say, especially when they speak together." "What did they tell him to convince him to leave the families alone?" Standing Bear smiled mysteriously. "They told him that protecting these white families would lead to something important. They said the spirits showed them a vision of a cowboy who would come to help bridge the gap between our peoples." Jake felt goosebumps rise on his arms despite the warmth of the fire. "A cowboy? A man with sun-weathered skin and kind blue eyes, riding a brown mare," Standing Bear said, watching Jake's face carefully. "A man who would choose to help others even when it put him in danger." Jake's mouth went dry. The description fit him perfectly, down to Belle's coloring. "They saw me in a vision?" "Ayanna and Nailnish have been waiting for you for 3 days, Standing Bear said. "They told me you would come looking for the missing families, and that when you found us, you would choose to understand rather than to fight." Jake looked across the fire at the two Apache girls, who were now watching him directly. Ayanna raised her hand in a small wave, and Nailnish smiled at him. There was something about their eyes that made Jake feel like they could see straight through to his soul. "This is why Red Hawk left without harming the white families," Standing Bear continued. "The girls told him that the cowboy from their vision would be important for our survival, and that protecting the white families was necessary to earn his trust." Jake felt overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. If the girls really had seen him in a vision, then his arrival here wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of some larger plan that he didn't fully understand yet. "What am I supposed to do?" Jake asked, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "First, you must help us figure out who is behind the false Apache attacks," Standing Bear said. "The real enemies are still out there, and they will not stop until they get the war they want." Jake nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of a much larger challenge. "And then?" "Then, you must help us find a way to make peace between our peoples," Standing Bear said. "Not just a temporary truce, but real peace that will last for generations. Jake looked around the camp at the Apache families and the settler captives who were now sleeping safely under Apache protection. The situation was so different from what he had expected that he was still trying to wrap his mind around it all. "I'm just a cowboy," Jake said. "I don't know anything about making peace between different peoples." Ayanna suddenly stood up and walked over to the fire. She knelt down beside Jake and spoke to him directly for the first time. "You are more than just a cowboy," she said in clear English with only a slight accent. "You chose to come here alone to help people you had never met. You chose to try to understand rather than to attack. That is not something just any cowboy would do." Her voice had a musical quality that made Jake want to keep listening. There was also something in her dark eyes that seemed much older and wiser than her teenage years would suggest. "The spirits showed us many possible futures," Nailnish added, joining her sister beside the fire. "In some, there is war and death for both our peoples. In others, there is peace and prosperity. The difference between these futures depends on choices that are made in the next few days." Jake felt the enormous weight of responsibility settling on him like a heavy blanket. These two young Apache women were telling him that the future of entire communities might depend on his actions. "What did your vision show me doing?" Jake asked, not sure if he really wanted to hear the answer. Ayanna and Nailnish looked at each other, and Jake could see some kind of silent communication pass between them. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "We saw you standing between two armies, stopping a battle that would have destroyed both sides," she said. "But we also saw you helping to catch the real enemies who are trying to start the war. And we saw something else," Nailnish added with a small smile. "We saw you becoming family to people who had never been family before." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. The idea of having a real family, people who cared about him and whom he could care about, was something he had dreamed of but never expected to find. "The vision showed us that our face markings would play an important role in saving your life," Ayanna said, touching the intricate patterns on her cheek. "When the time comes, you must trust these markings completely, even if you do not understand how they can help." Jake studied the girl's markings more carefully. Up close, he could see that they weren't just random patterns. They seemed to form symbols and shapes that meant something, though he couldn't decipher their meaning. "Our markings connect us to the spirits of our ancestors," Nailnish explained. "They also connect us to the land, to the animals, and to other people who have pure hearts. When danger comes, the markings will show you what to do," Ayanna added. "But you must be willing to trust what seems impossible." Jake felt like he was being asked to believe in magic, which went against his practical cowboy nature. But he also couldn't deny that these girls had accurately predicted his arrival and his choices. Maybe there were things in this world that couldn't be explained by logic alone. "There's something else you need to know," Standing Bear said, drawing Jake's attention back to him. "Red Hawk was not just angry about us protecting white families. He brought news that makes our situation much more dangerous." Jake felt his stomach tighten with worry. "What kind of news?" "The men who attacked the homesteads have been busy," Standing Bear said grimly. "They attacked 2 more settlements yesterday, and this time they left clear Apache arrows and war paint for people to find." Jake realized that the situation was escalating rapidly. How many people know the truth about the fake attacks? "Only the people in this camp," Standing Bear said. "And now you. Everyone else, including the authorities in your town, believes that Apache warriors are killing white families. Which means that if I go back to Cedar Creek and try to tell them what really happened, they probably won't believe me," Jake said, understanding the difficult position he was in. "Worse than that," Ayanna said. "If you go back and tell them you found the missing families living peacefully with Apache, they might think you have been turned against your own people." Jake hadn't thought of that possibility, but he realized the girls were right. Showing up in town with a story about peaceful Apache and fake raiders would probably make him look like a traitor or a madman. So what do we do? Jake asked. We have to catch the real attackers, Nailnish said firmly. We have to prove to everyone that Apache people are not the enemy. But, we also have to do it quickly, Standing Bear added. Red Hawk and the other warriors will only wait so long before they decide that my peaceful approach has failed. If that happens, they will take matters into their own hands. Jake understood that they were running out of time. If they couldn't expose the real culprits soon, the Apache warriors would likely launch their own attacks in response to the false ones. Once that happened, the situation would spiral into exactly the kind of war that someone was trying to create. Do you have any idea who might be behind the fake attacks? Jake asked. Standing Bear shook his head. Someone with money and organization. The fake Apache gear was well made, and the attacks were carefully planned. This is not the work of a few angry settlers. Jake thought about what he knew of the area and the people in it. Cedar Creek was a small town, but it was positioned along several trade routes. Maybe someone saw an opportunity to profit from a war between Apache and settlers. There are men who make money from conflict, Jake said slowly, thinking out loud. Gun sellers, land speculators, military suppliers. A war would be very profitable for the right people. Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. And, if Apache people were driven from these lands, someone could claim large amounts of territory for very little cost. Jake felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. We need to find out who in the area would benefit most from an Apache war. And, we need to find the fake raiders' camp, Nailnish added. If we can catch them in their costumes, we can prove what they have been doing. Jake looked around the Apache camp at all the people whose lives depended on resolving this situation peacefully. The sleeping settler families, the Apache children, the warriors who were being asked to trust in peace rather than fighting for their survival. All right, Jake said, making his decision. I'll help you catch the real raiders and stop this war. But, I'm going to need your help, especially from you two, he added, looking at Ayanna and Nailnish. Both girls smiled, and Jake saw determination in their eyes that matched his own. They were young, but they had already shown more courage and wisdom than many adults he had known. Tomorrow we start tracking the fake raiders, Standing Bear said. Tonight, you rest and prepare yourself. What we are about to do will be dangerous for all of us. As the camp settled down for the night, Jake found himself lying under the stars thinking about how dramatically his life had changed in just one day. This morning he had been a drifting cowboy looking for work. Tonight he was part of a plan to prevent a war and save two communities from destroying each other. He looked up at the vast desert sky, wondering if the Apache spirits that Ayanna and Nailnish spoke of were really watching over them. For the first time in his life, Jake felt like he might be part of something bigger than himself, something that actually mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and dangers, but tonight Jake Morrison slept better than he had in years, surrounded by people who had welcomed him as family even though they barely knew him. The morning sun painted the desert landscape in brilliant shades of orange and red as Jake woke to the smell of coffee brewing over the Apache campfire. His body was stiff from sleeping on the ground, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. He had a purpose now, something worth fighting for. Ayanna was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire and studying something in her hands. As Jake approached, he could see that she was examining a collection of small objects, beads, stones, feathers, and bits of metal arranged in specific patterns. "Good morning," Jake said quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever she was doing. Ayanna looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Jake Morrison. I have been asking the spirits for guidance about our hunt today." Jake poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot hanging over the fire. The brew was strong and bitter, but it helped chase away the last traces of sleep from his mind. "What do the spirits say?" "They show me water and stone," darkness and light dancing together, Ayanna said, gathering up her objects and placing them in a small leather pouch. The enemy we seek hides where these elements meet. Jake wasn't sure what to make of spiritual guidance, but he had learned to respect things he didn't fully understand. Does that give us a direction to search? Before Ayanna could answer, Nailnish approached leading 3 horses. 2 were Apache ponies, swift and sure-footed, while the third was Jake's mare Belle. "We leave soon," Nailnish announced. Red Hawk scouts reported fresh tracks leading toward Copper Canyon. If the fake raiders have a hidden camp, that would be a good place for it. Standing Bear joined them, carrying weapons and supplies for the journey. The old Apache leader looked tired, and Jake could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes. "I wish I could come with you," Standing Bear said, "but I must stay here to keep the peace in our camp. Some of the young warriors are getting restless, and the settler families need protection." Jake understood. If something happened to Standing Bear, the fragile peace between the Apache families and the settler captives could shatter instantly. The old man was the glue holding everything together. "Red Hawk wanted to send a dozen warriors with you," Standing Bear continued, "but I convinced him that a smaller group would be better for tracking and staying hidden." "Just the 3 of us?" Jake asked, feeling both honored and nervous about the responsibility. "Ayanna and Nailnish are worth 10 warriors each when it comes to scouting and tracking," Standing Bear said with pride. "And you have something the spirits value. Pure intention." As they prepared to leave, Mary Henderson, one of the rescued settler women, approached Jake. She was a woman in her 30s with sun-streaked brown hair and worried eyes. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. When those men attacked our home, I thought we were going to die. These Apache families saved our lives." Jake tipped his hat to her. "We're going to find out who really attacked you, ma'am. And we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Mary's young son Tommy ran up and tugged on Jake's coat. The boy was maybe 8 years old with freckles and missing front teeth. "Are you going to catch the bad men?" Tommy asked with the directness that only children possessed. "We're going to try our best," Jake promised, kneeling down to look Tommy in the eye. "You be good and help take care of your mama while we're gone." Tommy nodded seriously, then surprised Jake by whispering, "The Apache girls have magic markings. I saw them glow in the dark last night." Jake glanced at Ayanna and Nailnish, who were pretending not to listen to the conversation. He wasn't sure what to make of Tommy's claim, but children sometimes notice things that adults missed. "Magic or not, they're very brave," Jake told Tommy. "Just like you've been." As the 3 riders left the Apache camp, Jake felt the eyes of everyone watching them go. So much depended on what they would find in Copper Canyon. If they failed to expose the real raiders, the peace that Standing Bear had worked so hard to maintain would crumble. The ride toward Copper Canyon took them through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain Jake had ever seen. Red rock formations jutted up from the desert floor like ancient monuments, and narrow passages wound between towering cliffs that seemed to touch the sky. Ayanna rode ahead, following tracks that Jake could barely see. Her connection to the land was remarkable. She seemed to know instinctively which way to go even when the trail disappeared across bare rock. "She learned tracking from our grandfather," Nailnish explained, riding beside Jake. "He could follow a rabbit across stone for miles without losing its trail." "And what did you learn from your grandfather?" Jake asked. Nailnish smiled mysteriously. "I learned to see things that others miss. Hidden meanings, secret connections. The patterns that link all things together." As if to demonstrate her point, Nailnish suddenly raised her hand and called for them to stop. She pointed to what looked like an empty patch of desert, but when Jake looked closer, he could see the faint outline of recent horse tracks. 6 riders, Nailnish said confidently. all riding shod horses, heading northeast toward the canyon. They passed here yesterday evening. Jake was impressed by her skill. The tracks were so faint that he would have ridden right past them without noticing. Are these our fake raiders? Jake asked. Ayanna dismounted and knelt beside the tracks, touching the earth gently. The horses are tired and carrying extra weight, she said. Probably supplies for a hidden camp. Or Apache disguises, Nailnish added grimly. They followed the trail for several more miles, moving carefully to avoid being spotted by anyone who might be watching. As they got closer to Copper Canyon, the landscape became more rugged and provided better cover for traveling unseen. The canyon itself was a massive crack in the earth, with steep walls that glowed copper-red in the sunlight. A stream ran along the bottom, providing precious water in the desert environment. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could hide a camp and remain undetected for weeks. We go on foot from here, Ayanna whispered, pointing to a narrow trail that led down into the canyon. The horses would make too much noise on the rocks. They secured their mounts in a hidden grove and began the careful descent into the canyon. Jake's boots slipped on the loose stones several times, but the Apache girls moved as silently as shadows, their moccasins finding purchase where his boots could not. As they worked their way down toward the canyon floor, Jake began to hear sounds that didn't belong in the wilderness, men's voices, the whinny of horses, and the clatter of metal equipment. Ayanna held up her hand, signaling for them to freeze. She pointed toward a bend in the canyon where a thin wisp of smoke was rising into the air. Someone had a campfire burning, and that someone was trying to keep it hidden. Moving with extreme care, the three scouts crept along the canyon wall until they could see around the bend. What they found there made Jake's blood run cold. A large camp was spread out along the canyon floor, with more than a dozen men moving around between tents and supply wagons. But these weren't ordinary travelers or miners. Scattered around the camp were Apache war bonnets, painted shields, bows and arrows, and other Native American gear. "This is it," Jake whispered. "This is where they're staging the fake attacks." But, as they watched longer, Jake realized the situation was even worse than he had thought. These men weren't just pretending to be Apache, they were planning something much bigger. Near the center of the camp, a large man with a black beard was addressing a group of about 20 men. Jake couldn't hear all the words, but he caught enough to understand that they were planning multiple simultaneous attacks on settler communities. "Tomorrow night," the bearded man was saying, "we hit 3 towns at once. Cedar Creek, Willowbrook, and Mesa Verde. Make it look like a coordinated Apache uprising." One of the other men raised his hand. "What about the cavalry? Won't they respond?" The bearded leader laughed harshly. "That's exactly what we want. Once the army gets involved, the Apache will have to fight back or be massacred. Either way, they'll be driven off their land, and we'll be able to buy it up for practically nothing." Jake felt sick to his stomach. These men weren't just trying to start isolated conflicts, they were planning to trigger a full-scale war that would destroy both Apache and settler communities. Nailnish touched Jake's arm and pointed to another part of the camp. There, Jake could see men trying on Apache clothing and practicing with traditional weapons. The disguises were remarkably convincing. In poor light, they could easily pass for real Apache warriors. "We have to stop this," Jake whispered, but, even as he said it, he realized how impossible their situation was. 3 people against more than 20 armed men, the odds were hopeless. Ayanna seemed to read his thoughts. "We cannot fight them directly," she agreed quietly. "But, we do not have to. We just have to prove what they are doing." "How?" Jake asked. "We steal one of their fake costumes," Nailnish said. "If we can get it back to town, we can show everyone what's really happening." Jake looked at the camp below and tried to figure out how they could possibly get close enough to steal anything without being caught. The men were armed and alert, and the canyon provided no cover once you reached the floor. "There's another problem," Jake pointed out. "Even if we get proof, who's going to believe us? These men obviously have money and organization. They probably have friends in high places." Ayanna smiled mysteriously. "That is where our markings come in. The spirits told us this moment would come." Jake looked at the intricate patterns painted on both girls' faces and arms. In the canyon's shadows, the markings seemed to have a subtle luminescence that made them stand out against their dark skin. "What do your markings do, exactly?" Jake asked. "They connect us to the truth of all things," Nailnish said. "When the time is right, they will show everyone exactly what needs to be seen." Jake still wasn't sure he believed in spiritual magic, but he was running out of alternatives. "What do you need me to do?" "Tonight, when the moon is high, we will go down into their camp," Ayanna explained. "You will create a distraction while we gather evidence. But, when the danger comes, and it will come, you must trust our markings completely." "What kind of distraction?" Jake asked, though he had a feeling he wasn't going to like the answer. "You will walk into their camp and challenge them," Nailnish said matter-of-factly. "Tell them you know what they are doing and demand that they stop." Jake stared at her. "That sounds like a good way to get myself killed." "The spirits have shown us that you will survive," Ayanna assured him. "But, only if you trust our markings when the moment comes. You must believe in what seems impossible." As the day wore on, Jake watched the fake raider camp and tried to prepare himself mentally for what they were planning. He had never been one to back down from a fight, but walking into a camp full of armed men and challenging them seemed like suicide. The sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in deep reds and purples. As darkness fell, the raiders lit torches around their camp, creating dancing shadows on the stone walls. "It's time," Ayanna whispered. Jake checked his weapons one final time and said a silent prayer to whatever spirits might be listening. As he prepared to climb down into the canyon, he thought about all the people counting on them: Standing Bear, Mary Henderson and her son, the Apache families, the townspeople of Cedar Creek who had no idea what was coming. "Remember," Nailnish said, touching his arm, "when you see our markings glow, that is the signal. Trust what they show you, no matter how impossible it seems." Jake nodded, took a deep breath, and began climbing down toward the raider camp. Behind him, Ayanna and Nailnish melted into the shadows like ghosts, moving to positions where they could observe and act when the time came. As Jake reached the canyon floor and began walking toward the firelight, he could hear his heart pounding in his ears. The men in the camp were laughing and drinking, celebrating their upcoming attacks on innocent families. When Jake stepped into the circle of firelight, conversation stopped instantly. More than 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and hands moved toward weapons. "Well, well," said the bearded leader, standing up slowly. "What do we have here? A lost cowboy?" "I'm not lost," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I came here looking for the men who have been attacking settlers and blaming it on the Apache." The bearded man laughed, but his eyes were cold and dangerous. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Cowboy. You got any proof of what you're saying?" Jake gestured toward the Apache costumes scattered around the camp. "I'd say the evidence is pretty obvious." The laughter stopped abruptly, and Jake could feel the mood in the camp shift from amusement to threat. Several men stood up and began moving to surround him. "You know what I think," the bearded leader said, pulling out a large knife. "I think you're a spy. Maybe working for the Apache themselves." "I think you're right, boss," said one of the other men. "Question is, what do we do with him?" Jake knew he was in serious trouble. These men couldn't afford to let him live with what he had seen. He looked around desperately for any sign of Ayanna and Nailnish, but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the firelight. "I think we make an example of him," the leader said, stepping closer with his knife drawn. "Can't have people nosing around in our business." Suddenly, Jake saw something that made him blink in disbelief. High up on the canyon wall, two sets of markings were beginning to glow with a soft, otherworldly light. The intricate patterns on Ayana and Nailnish's faces were becoming visible even from a distance, pulsing gently like living things. As Jake watched in amazement, the glowing markings began to move, shifting positions on the canyon walls in impossible ways. It was as if the girls could project their spiritual markings anywhere they chose, creating patterns of light in the darkness. "What the hell is that?" one of the raiders shouted, pointing up at the glowing symbols. The entire camp erupted in confusion as more patterns appeared on different canyon walls, surrounding the raiders with shifting designs that seemed to tell a story in light and shadow. "Apache magic," someone yelled. "We're surrounded by Apache spirits." In the chaos that followed, Jake saw his chance. While the raiders were distracted by the impossible light show above them, he dove behind a supply wagon and began crawling toward where he had seen Apache costumes piled up. The glowing markings continued to move and dance on the canyon walls, creating patterns that were both beautiful and terrifying. Some of the raiders were shooting at the lights, but their bullets had no effect on the spiritual projections. "It's the ghost Apache," the bearded leader shouted. "They've come for revenge." Jake managed to grab an entire Apache costume, war bonnet, painted shield, and traditional weapons, while the raiders were in panic. But, as he tried to escape with the evidence, one of the men spotted him. "There's the spy," the man yelled. "He's stealing our gear." Suddenly, Jake found himself running through the canyon with armed men chasing him, while impossible lights danced on the walls above. It was the strangest and most terrifying experience of his life. As bullets whistled past his head, Jake saw the glowing markings shift again, this time forming an arrow pointing toward a narrow passage between the rocks. Without hesitation, he followed the spiritual guidance, diving into the opening just as more shots rang out behind him. The passage was too narrow for the raiders to follow quickly, but Jake knew they would find a way around soon enough. He had to reach the horses and get the evidence back to town before the fake Apache costume became his burial shroud. As he emerged from the passage higher up on the canyon wall, Jake saw Ayana and Nailnish waiting for him with the horses. Their face markings were still glowing softly, though not as brightly as when they had been projected on the canyon walls. "How did you do that?" Jake gasped, still trying to catch his breath. "The spirits of our ancestors helped us," Ayana said simply. "They wanted to make sure you escaped with the proof we need." "Did you get it?" Nailnish asked urgently. Jake held up the stolen Apache costume. "Everything we need to prove they're fake raiders. But they know we were there. They'll be coming after us." "Then, we must ride fast," Ayana said, mounting her pony in one fluid motion. "But, first, we have one more stop to make." "Where?" Jake asked, swinging into Belle's saddle. "The telegraph office in Mesa Verde," Nailnish said. "We need to warn all the towns about tomorrow night's attacks." As they raced through the darkness with the evidence that could prevent a war, Jake marveled at what he had witnessed. Whether it was magic, technology, or something else entirely, the Apache girls' markings had saved his life and given them the proof they needed to expose the truth. But their mission was far from over. They still had to survive the night, reach the towns in time to prevent the attacks, and convince people to believe a story that sounded impossible. The hardest challenges still lay ahead. The horses thundered across the desert under a blanket of stars as Jake, Ayana, and Nailnish raced toward Mesa Verde. Jake clutched the stolen Apache costume tightly, knowing it was their only hope of preventing the coordinated attacks planned for the next evening. Belle was breathing hard but maintaining pace with the Apache ponies, whose endurance in desert terrain was legendary. Jake could hear pursuing riders behind them in the distance, but the sound was growing fainter as they pulled ahead. "How far to Mesa Verde?" Jake called out over the sound of hoofbeats. 2 hours if we push the horses, Nailnish replied, leaning low over her pony's neck. But, the telegraph office closes at 10 o'clock. Jake pulled out his pocket watch and squinted at it in the moonlight. It was already past 8:30, and they still had hard riding ahead of them. Even if they made it to Mesa Verde in time, they would need to convince a telegraph operator to send urgent warnings to 3 different towns based on a story that sounded completely unbelievable. As they crested a small hill, Ayanna suddenly pulled her pony to a stop and raised her hand for the others to halt as well. In the distance, Jake could see the lights of Mesa Verde, but, between them and the town were more riders, at least 6 men on horseback blocking the main trail. "They got ahead of us somehow," Jake said, feeling his heart sink. The fake raiders must have known a shortcut that allowed them to reach the town before Jake's group could get there. "There is another way," Ayanna said quietly. "But, it is dangerous, especially in the dark." "More dangerous than riding into an ambush?" Jake asked. Nailnish pointed toward a series of rocky outcroppings to their left. "There is an old Apache trail through those rocks. It comes out behind the town, but the path is very narrow. One wrong step and you fall 50 feet onto sharp stones." Jake looked at the treacherous terrain and, then, at the roadblock ahead. They didn't really have a choice. "Lead the way." The Apache trail was even more dangerous than Nailnish had described. It wound along the edge of cliffs and through passages so narrow that Jake had to pull his feet up to keep them from scraping against the rock walls. Several times, loose stones scattered away from Belle's hooves and clattered down into invisible chasms below. But Ayanna and Nailnish moved along the trail like they had traveled it 100 times before. Their ponies seemed to know exactly where to step, even in the darkness. Jake marveled at their skill and tried not to think about what would happen if Belle made a wrong step. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged from the rocks behind Mesa Verde's main street. The town was quiet except for light and noise coming from the saloon and a few other buildings. "The telegraph office is 2 blocks down," Jake said, recognizing the layout of the town from previous visits. "But, we need to be careful. Those riders might have men waiting in town too." They left their horses in an alley behind the general store and made their way carefully toward the telegraph office. Jake carried the stolen Apache costume in a burlap sack, trying to make it less obvious what he was carrying. As they approached the telegraph office, Jake could see lights still burning in the window. The operator was still there, but for how much longer? "Wait here and keep watch," Jake told Ayanna and Nailnish. "If anyone comes, create a distraction like you did at the raiders' camp." Jake pushed open the door to the telegraph office, setting off a small bell that announced his arrival. The operator, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his desk with an expression of mild annoyance. "We're closing in 5 minutes, the operator said. "Whatever message you need to send will have to wait until tomorrow." "This can't wait," Jake said urgently. "Lives depend on getting this information out tonight." The operator sighed and gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "All right, but make it quick. What's the message and where's it going?" Jake took a deep breath and pulled the Apache war bonnet out of his sack. "I need to send warnings to the sheriffs in Cedar Creek, Willowbrook, and Mesa Verde. Tell them that fake Apache raiders are planning coordinated attacks tomorrow night." The telegraph operator stared at the war bonnet and, then, looked at Jake like he had lost his mind. "Fake Apache raiders? Son, have you been drinking?" "I'm completely sober," Jake said firmly. "Look at this bonnet carefully. See anything unusual about it?" The operator examined the war bonnet more closely, and Jake could see confusion growing on his face. "The feathers are wrong," the man said slowly. "These are dyed chicken feathers, not eagle feathers. And this beadwork, it's machine-made, not hand-sewn." "Exactly," Jake said. Real Apache warriors don't wear machine-made costumes with chicken feathers. Someone is dressing up like Apache to make it look like they're attacking settlements. The telegraph operator set down the war bonnet and looked at Jake with new interest. That's a serious accusation. You have any other proof? Before Jake could answer, the office door burst open and 3 armed men rushed in. Jake recognized them as members of the fake raider gang from Copper Canyon. Well, said the first man through the door. Looks like our spy made it to town after all. The telegraph operator jumped up from his chair, clearly terrified. What's going on here? Who are you men? Just some concerned citizens making sure dangerous lies don't get spread around, the raider said, pointing his gun at Jake. You see, this cowboy here is working with the Apache to spread false stories about honest white men. Jake knew he was in serious trouble. The raiders had arrived too quickly after the chase from Copper Canyon. They must have had men positioned in town all along, which meant this operation was even bigger than he had thought. The only lies being spread are by you and your friends, Jake said, trying to buy time and hoping that Ayanna and Nailnish would realize something was wrong. Is that so? The raider leader said with a cold smile. Well, I guess we'll just have to make sure your lying days are over. Just as the man raised his gun to fire, the windows of the telegraph office suddenly blazed with brilliant light. The intricate patterns of Ayanna and Nailnish's spiritual markings appeared on the glass, glowing so brightly that everyone in the room had to shield their eyes. What in the name of, the raider leader started to say, but his words were cut off as the glowing patterns began to move and shift, telling a story in light and shadow. The markings showed images of men in fake Apache costumes attacking innocent families, of the hidden camp in Copper Canyon, of the planned coordinated attacks on 3 towns. It was like watching a moving picture show, but made of pure light projected by spiritual power. The telegraph operator stood transfixed, watching the amazing display. Is this real? He whispered. Are those spirits telling us what really happened? Apache devil magic, one of the raiders shouted, but Jake could hear the fear in his voice. The glowing markings continued their story, showing the faces of the raider leaders and revealing their plans for the next night's attacks. When the spiritual light show finally ended, the telegraph office fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. I believe you, the telegraph operator said to Jake, his voice shaking with awe. Whatever I just saw, it was showing me the truth. I can feel it. Don't listen to him, the raider leader shouted. It's just Apache tricks and lies. But Jake could see that the man's conviction was shaken. He had witnessed something that couldn't be explained by ordinary means, and it had shown him things that were clearly true. Send those telegrams, Jake told the operator urgently. Warn all 3 towns about tomorrow night's attacks. The telegraph operator nodded and moved toward his equipment, but the raider leader stepped in front of him with his gun drawn. Nobody's sending any telegrams, the man said. And nobody's leaving this office alive. That's where you're wrong, said a new voice from the doorway. Jake turned to see Ayanna and Nailnish standing in the entrance, their face markings still glowing softly. But they weren't alone. Behind them stood Sheriff Tom Bradley from Cedar Creek and 4 of his deputies, all with weapons drawn. Sheriff Bradley? Jake said in amazement. How did you get here? Got a telegraph message an hour ago saying there was trouble in Mesa Verde, the sheriff said, keeping his gun trained on the raiders. Message said to look for a cowboy named Jake Morrison who had important information about the Apache attacks. Jake looked at Ayanna and Nailnish in confusion. But we didn't send any telegram. Nailnish smiled mysteriously. The spirits work in ways beyond our understanding. Sometimes they can speak through the wires just as easily as they speak through our markings. The raider leader made a desperate move, lunging toward the telegraph operator with his knife, but Ayanna was faster. Her glowing markings flared brightly, and the man suddenly stopped in his tracks as if frozen by an invisible force. What's happening to me?" the raider gasped, unable to move his arms or legs. "The truth has power," Ayanna said simply. "And, you have lived too long with lies." Sheriff Bradley and his deputies quickly disarmed and arrested the 3 raiders while Jake explained everything that had happened. He showed them the fake Apache costume and described the hidden camp in Copper Canyon where more than 20 men were preparing for coordinated attacks. "This explains a lot," Sheriff Bradley said, examining the machine-made war bonnet. "I always wondered why the Apache attacks seemed so theatrical. Real Apache warriors are much more subtle." The telegraph operator, still shaken by what he had witnessed, sent urgent messages to all 3 targeted towns warning them about the planned attacks. Within an hour, responses came back confirming that extra security would be in place to protect the communities. "What about the men still at Copper Canyon?" Jake asked. "We'll organize a joint operation with the Army," Sheriff Bradley said. "With your testimony and this evidence, we should be able to round up the whole gang." As the immediate crisis passed, Jake found himself standing outside the telegraph office with Ayanna and Nailnish under the starry desert sky. The danger wasn't completely over yet, but they had successfully prevented what could have been a devastating war between Apache and settler communities. "I still don't understand how you did all of this," Jake said, gesturing toward their markings, which were still faintly glowing. "The lights, the telegraph message, stopping that man from moving. Our markings connect us to the spirit world," Ayanna explained. "But they also connect us to people whose hearts are pure. When you chose to help our people instead of fighting us, you became linked to our spiritual power." "Which means?" Jake asked. "Which means you are Apache family now," Nailnish said with a warm smile. "The spirits have claimed you as one of ours." Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. For the first time in his life, he truly belonged somewhere, with people who had chosen to call him family. Over the next few days, everything unfolded as Sheriff Bradley had promised. A joint force of lawmen and cavalry surrounded the raiders' camp at Copper Canyon and arrested more than 30 men involved in the fake Apache attack scheme. The investigation revealed that the operation had been funded by a group of wealthy land speculators who wanted to drive Apache people off valuable mineral-rich territory. By creating a war, they could buy the land cheaply after the government forcibly relocated the Apache tribes. The real Apache families were finally able to return the rescued settler families to their homes in Cedar Creek. Mary Henderson and her son Tommy insisted on personally thanking Standing Bear and his people for saving their lives. "I don't know how to repay you for what you did," Mary told Standing Bear through Jake, who had become the unofficial translator between the communities. "Teach your son the truth about what happened here," Standing Bear replied. "Help him grow up knowing that Apache and white people can be friends and neighbors instead of enemies." Tommy Henderson became fascinated by Ayanna and Nailnish's spiritual markings and begged them to teach him about Apache ways. The girls agreed, and soon other children from both communities were learning from each other, creating friendships that would last for generations. Jake found himself in a unique position as a bridge between the two communities. He spent half his time helping Standing Bear's people navigate relationships with white authorities, and the other half helping settler families understand Apache culture and customs. "You have found your purpose," Ayanna told him one evening as they sat around the fire at the Apache camp. "The spirits knew you were meant to bring our peoples together. What they're saying," Nailnish added with a grin, "is that you're stuck with us now. No more drifting from place to place." Jake laughed and looked around at the faces gathered around the fire, Apache families and settler families sitting together, sharing food and stories. Children who had been strangers a week ago were now playing together as if they had known each other their whole lives. "I can think of worse places to be stuck," Jake said. As the months passed, Jake helped establish a permanent trading post where Apache families and settlers could meet safely to exchange goods and news. The location became known as Morrison's Bridge, named after the cowboy who had helped prevent a war. Iona and Nailnish's spiritual markings gradually faded as the immediate crisis passed, but their wisdom and courage continued to guide both communities. They became respected leaders among their people, often consulted when difficult decisions needed to be made. Jake never did learn to fully understand the spiritual powers that had saved his life and prevented the war, but he didn't need to understand them to appreciate their effects. The two communities continued to live in peace, working together to build something better than either could have achieved alone. Years later, when Jake was an old man with children and grandchildren of his own, both Apache and settler, he would tell the story of the night when glowing markings on canyon walls had saved his life and changed the destiny of two peoples. The most important magic, he would always conclude his story, is the magic that happens when people choose to see each other as family instead of enemies. Everything else is just details. The desert wind would carry his words across the landscape where Apache and settler communities continued to thrive side by side, living proof that even the deepest divisions could be healed when people of courage chose to build bridges instead of walls. And, in quiet moments, when the light was just right, some people swore they could still see faint traces of spiritual markings glowing on the canyon walls, a reminder that some bonds, once forged in truth and sacrifice, could never be broken. Jake Morrison had started his journey as a drifting cowboy with no place to call home. He ended it as the patriarch of a family that spanned two cultures, a living symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict. The Apache girl's markings had indeed saved him, but not in the way he had expected. They had saved him from a life of loneliness and given him something worth protecting, a family, a community, and a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. In the end, that was the greatest magic of all.